3 heavy knocks at my door in the middle of November. Not the tentative rap of a neighbor dropping by, not the loose, nervous thump of a kid playing with an old board. 3 deliberate, slow hits, each one a hand-sized promise of something impossible outside the yellow pool of the porch light. The wind had been carving the night into thin blades, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. Wet fur and cedar, like a riverbank after thaw. My heart tightened in a way that felt familiar and jaw-deep. I was 52 the night it happened. The porch light blurred the outline into a shape that didn't fit the world I'd built with sawdust and radio static, with a wife I'd married and 2 kids who grew up chasing fireflies behind the lean-to. For a second, my chest slid away from me. I thought of every choice I'd made that could land a hulking thing on my doorstep. Then the memory came back, clean as a pressed photograph. It had all started in a blizzard in January of 1974. If you like stranger than fiction, stay with me for a bit. This isn't one of those campfire tall tales. This is what it felt like to care for something that wasn't supposed to be in the same world as us, and then watch that care circle back 20 years later. January 74 was a whiteout that made even the radio hum like a morning call. I was 32, running a '71 Chevy C10 up and down the stretch they call Tower 7 out past Hamilton, monitoring the repeater and doing odd jobs for people who needed a hand in the Bitterroots. The snow sat on the road in drifts like folding doors, and the truck's heater worked in fits. 1 minute there'd be warm breath, then nothing as the engine clogged with wet cold. I remember the way the light from the truck's headlights blew through the air, little blades of ice stamping in the beam. I'd come around a blind corner. There's a bend there where the pines press close, and there, half buried in a packed bank, was something that did not belong in the rut of tracks. A small, hunched shape, chest rising shallow under a coat of white. It took me a while to decide what it was. At first I thought it was a deer fawn that the storm had nicked, fluttering and gone. Then it moved in a way that made my stomach flip. Small hands, the way the fingers spread. It was almost human in the way it craned its neck, but the face was furred, and huge, dark eyes stared up at the roof of the Chevy as if pleading for a light. I pulled the truck wide, shut the motor off, and climbed up into the cab so I could hear the wind stop. The air was so sharp it cleaned the inside of my skull. I wasn't supposed to leave my post, not with the tower relay depending on me. But when something is right there, in front of you, frozen into the shape of a life, most rules become paper. I wrapped my coat around me and sank into the drift. The snow hanged from the pines like prayer flags. The little thing shivered when I touched it, little shoulders jolting, breath like a dog's. Its fur had white clumps in it where the threads of snow had stuck. It smelled of wet earth and a sweetness I can't name, like moss warmed by a slant of sun. I scooped it up as easily as a sack of grain, and the world narrowed to the grind of snow under my boots and the weight in my arms. Back at the cabin, the stove took the cold from its bones. I sat it on the kitchen chair and found a loose board to make a splint. Its leg was bent wrong. One of the long bones had taken a hit, I guessed, and the knee was a hard knot where it shouldn't be. I had plaster and wire in the truck from other jobs. I knew enough to make something that would hold it steady. I remember thinking at the time, odd thinking given what I'd pulled from the road, that if I set this thing's leg wrong, I might do more harm. But I'd always been the kind of man to try fixing things rather than cursing them. That night, the radio in the corner hummed with distant chatter. Outside the window, the blizzard hammered the eaves. Inside, the cabin smelled of kerosene and the bread I'd left under a cloth. I made it a bed with a wool blanket and a board to keep the draft off its face. It slept with a hand splayed on top of the blanket, fingers long and calloused in a way that made me think of the old men who worked the logging trails. When it woke, it was small and fierce in equal measure. It eyed me hard, head cocked, as if cataloging my shape. It had a high, thin cry at first, and then a low chuffing sound. I set up a little music tape, Carole King's Tapestry. The tape was worn and the case cracked, and played a song. The voice rose out of the tape, smooth and warm, and something in the small creature's face unknotted. It leaned in like a person who'd been listening to a tune from some other lifetime and remembered the rest of it. Naming someone is a dangerous thing. It gives a being an anchor to your life and makes you responsible for telling that name back to them when the time comes. I called him Little Bit because he fit in the crook of my arm like a piece of a pocket. He had a name on his own, I'm sure. Names that go long as riverbeds among his people, but names that live in the woods don't suit the way we name things in town. Little Bit came easy, and in my head it always sounded like a small joke, an apology maybe, for lifting him out of a snowbank on a night the world was serious. You learn quick what a thing's body needs when it's cold and scared. I warmed water and made soup, thin and mild, and spooned it like I'd spooned broth for men after they'd been out on a hard day. Little Bit would eat from a spoon if you gave it something soft. It had a way of looking up that stopped the breath in your throat. His eyes were round and dark, reflecting the lamplight like a pair of wet stones. At night, he'd sit near the stove with me and listen to the tape over and over. There's a moment on that album where the piano holds a note so long you feel the house settling with it. Little Bit would press his palm to the speaker, and his whole face would soften, as if the sound smoothed whatever barbed edges the world had given him. Once, he put his forehead to my chest and draped two huge arms around my waist, and there was nothing to be done but hold him. He smelled like wet cedar and something sweeter, like the underside of a log where the sap runs. I won't lie, I was afraid. There were nights when I'd lie awake listening to the breathe of the wood stove and imagine men with shotguns on the ridge, or a truck full of strangers coming to take away the thing that made my house less ordinary. There are people who will tell you not to shelter the unknown. They have reasons: fear of the law, fear of danger. But when something smaller than you and quieter than your worst nights looks up at you and asks for shelter with no words, what do? I had to choose. We did what we could for that winter. I fashioned a splint and tied it on with a strip of torn canvas. I kept the door latched and the curtains closed. The snow shrank the days like wax. There's a peculiar quality to a month where your main work is to keep a life warm. The world compresses to routines: food, fire, voice. I taught Little Bit to eat from a bowl. He taught me how to listen in moments of near silence. There were things he did that made me laugh, and things that made me cry quietly into my hands. Once, he fooled with my radio, the dial spinning in slow, curious moves, and he made static bloom like flowers. He would sit in the doorway sometimes, forehead resting on the threshold, as if he could press his way into both the cabin and the forest at once. He would look at the moon, and in those long nights his small chest would swell with a sound like a lullaby that wasn't ours. When spring pressed through the drift and the road cleared, the choice loomed like a mountain pass. You can't keep a creature like that in a cabin forever. The woods were his. He belonged to the pines and the riverbeds and the shifting ragged places between mountain and man. Keeping him on my porch would be akin to asking a wild thing to wear living in the shape of a man. That felt cruel in a way I hadn't expected. So, on a morning when the snow had turned to slushy lines and the sun was a thrift store penny, I walked into the edge of the trees with Little Bit on my shoulder. He smelled different out there, the world loosening his muscles the way warm water loosens knots. I told him, in the kind of voice you use when you're sending a child off to school, that he had to learn the ways of the forest again. He looked up at me then, and for a second he put both palms on my cheeks in a movement that was almost human, and then stamped his feet in a little dance that I think was sadness. He stood at the tree line, and for the first time he made a sound that sounded like words. It came slow and shaped, as if plucked out of a memory where language was heavy with moss.
"Patrick, friend," he said, and it was like somebody had pressed a coin into my hand. "Never forgot." I wanted to say, "Bring them back. Stay. Tell me where you came from." But I knew the answer would be a world I couldn't hold. So I nodded and watched him go. Watched him recede until his outline stitched into the dark of the pines. He turned once and lifted a hand in that small wave, half human, half something else, and then the woods swallowed him. After that, life moved the way life does when you're carrying a secret that needs no words. I threw myself into work. I fixed radios, I rebuilt a fence for an old man up the road, I replaced a step at the schoolhouse. I kept a quiet map in my head of where Little Bit had disappeared. Places where the brush bent into seams and the streams ran dark with tannin. I talked about it to nobody at first. You don't always tell your wife the whole of the things you've done before you meet her. There's a shame in the way secrets stand between people. Sometimes you tell yourself you're protecting the person you love when you're only protecting yourself from judgment. I met Sarah in the spring of '76. She was down from Missoula helping her sister after a birth. She had a way of folding laughter into sentences so it made them fit better. Her boots stomped in the mud like punctuation. We married the next year, quick as a man who knows what he's missing. Emma came in '77 and Jake in '79. 2 children I adored and feared in equal measure. When they were small, mornings smelled of cereal and the wood stove, of faded comic books and the scent of whatever project I'd left on the bench overnight. Sarah trusted me the way you do when you accept the woman you fall asleep beside. And for years, I kept the part of the life that had the woods in it separate. I'd tell her I was called out for tower work or to fix a relay. I'd say the truck needed a run and leave at dawn. I hated that I lied by omission. There were nights when I wanted to shove all this into the middle of the table and let the truth be its own thing. But the truth had teeth. It would bite our life open and let the cold in. I told myself lying was the kind of sin you could make small. Over the years, Little Bit drifted through my dreams like a steady ghost. Sometimes I'd catch a shape in the pines out by the river, and my hand would go to the door like a reflex. The world outside the cabin changed whether I wanted it to or not. Logging roads opened where there had been none. Trucks full of men with measuring tapes and cameras went deeper and deeper into the places I'd once thought were infinite. The woods shrank in tricky human ways. Houses arrived along the ridgelines. Lights dawned where the stars had been thickest. Still, the thought of Little Bit living and growing out there felt like a miracle I could savor without touching. It let me be a better husband for a while.
Then the world shifted again in a different kind of way. There was talk at the diner about the sort of thing you see on late-night TV. Strange footprints by the river, a sighting out near the Clear Creek Trail. People winked over coffee and told stories. I kept my mouth closed, and I kept my eyes open. Secrets have a gravity of their own. They bend everything close. There's a kind of life you get used to. The staccato rhythm of raising children, the smell of oil and sawdust, the static on the radio when a storm is coming. But it doesn't make you braver, it makes you careful. Sarah, practical as she was, learned to read my hands. She could tell when something sat heavy on me, the way a loose stone might sit heavy in a boot. There were afternoons when she would find me staring out at the pines, and she'd come up beside me and rest her head on my shoulder. Once she asked if I'd ever been in love with the mountains more than with her. I told her no, because the truth couldn't be that simple. I loved the mountains and the mysterious thing that had once lived there, yes, but I also loved her for the mathematics of a life she kept anchored. The children grew. Emma was quiet and fierce with her own small moral compass. She'd be born into a world where the Walkman was normal and the '71 Chevy was getting more rust than shine. Jake came in '79, and he had Sarah's laugh. We put a swing up in the yard, and they learned to read the road signs when we drove to town. Music, the same tapes I'd listened to with Little Bit, filled the truck on long drives. Sometimes, between the recorded songs, I'd hum a tune to myself, and the sound of it would feel like a small key to an old door. Years went by like logs sliding down a river. I worked at Tower 7 for stretches, keeping the repeater on when the weather went sour. Those nights were where the past and the present met. The tower's blinking light, the hum of machinery, the way the radio would carry someone's voice from miles away like a human thread. I kept a weathered photograph of a small form on the bedside table for a long time.
And then, one day, I put it in the toolbox and stopped looking at it as often. That was the way secrets age. You wear them into a dullness that can make you forget they are even there. In the meantime, Little Bit grew in the world outside my fences. I imagined him sometimes walking tall underneath the same pines that shadowed my children's forts. I imagined him laughing in a way that shook the branches. I imagined advantages I did not have: strength, speed, the kind of life that does not answer to the county line. But I also imagined danger: hunters with the kind of sight that mistakes the unusual for threat, the inexorable march of machines cutting through places that once hid things like him. In the meantime, Little Bit grew in the world outside my fences. I imagined him sometimes walking tall underneath the same pines that shadowed my children's forts. I imagined him laughing in a way that shook the branches. I imagined advantages I did not have: strength, speed, the kind of life that does not answer to the county line. But I also imagined danger: hunters with the kind of sight that mistakes the unusual for threat, the inexorable march of machines cutting through places that once hid things like him. There is one memory I keep with me when the nights are quiet and the fire low. One vivid slice of time when Little Bit and I sat on the back stoop and listened to Carole King as if the music was a tether between our two strange lives. He put his massive hand around my wrist and held it like a child holding a father's. He never could have spoken much then. Little Bit learned words the way a metal worker learns tempering steel. He heard and he tried to imitate, and eventually the sounds came. Over the years, snippets of what he'd heard in the woods would find their way into the porch conversations we had late in secret. A low intonation that meant something like, "We remember," and a half-phrase that felt like a prayer. It held me in a way that changed me without me knowing it. You do things that you think are small: put out a bowl of soup, fold a blanket, and they accrue until you are different. I would bend the rules again and again, thinking each time that my small mercies mattered only to me. The truth is, small mercies shift the shape of the world in slow, almost invisible ways. Then, one night in November of 1994, when the moon had been drawn thin as a coin and the air had that particular razor-edge cold, I woke to the sound of the knocks. They were deliberate, 3 of them, like someone who had learned the ritual and wanted to be sure it was remembered. I could hear nothing else at first. The house was asleep. And then Emma's bedroom door creaked as the house settled on itself. I did something I had not allowed myself in years. I walked to the door barefoot, the old floor cool under my feet, and I pulled the curtain aside. There it was, the silhouette. It towered like a pine stump, wider than any man I'd ever seen in the doorway. Its shoulders hunched to fit the frame. But the thing that hit me harder than the bulk or the smell was recognition. The way the shoulder sloped at the same angle as Little Bit's when he sat on my stoop all those years ago. The tilt of the head in a way that implied courtesy, like someone who had seen civilization's rules and learned them for the sake of a favor. For a moment, time spun in the center. The porch light haloed the shape, and my mind ran through decades of choices. My chest felt like a drum. I could hear the house breathing, a furnace tick, the creak of settling joists, a faint wind skipping nails in the eaves. I thought of Sarah, asleep in our bed, of Emma and Jake in the next rooms, and of a life that had been put together on quiet, stable lies and little careful truths. The shape took another breath, and, to my astonishment, a voice, the same slow, patient syllables that had surprised me out in the snow all those years ago, found sound. It was not full English, not in the clean lines of town speech. It was measured and careful, and, when translation is the only thing left to do, it might be called a form of English borrowed and worn over many winters. It said my name. Patrick, it said.
The voice filled the small porch and the wood and the cold air between one life and another. My name, called at the outer edge of my world, and with it, the thing that had started on a January road all those years ago folded back into the present. I stood there, curtain half open, all the years pressing in like hands. The silhouette waited. The noises from the house, an old clock, the soft, habitual tick that had been its own kind of music, fell away. The night was waiting for me to decide. I eased the latch and the door opened a hair. The porch light threw the thing into relief. Hands huge as bent paddles. Hair that shone wet in the electricity like oil. A face that held a sadness older than the tree rings. The smell of cedar and riverbed came up so strong it made my throat close. For a second there was nothing but the sound of the world finding its fits. Then the shape shifted forward, and, in the cadence of speech I had only a few moments to remember, it said again, in a way that made my chest break open. Patrick, friend, never forgot. I could feel the whole line of years between us tremble. The door was a door. Behind it was a house that had been built on roads and schedules, on a marriage that had already held storms. In front of me was a thing that had once been a child in a snowbank. I had to move, not because the thing asked me to, though it had the posture of a plea, but because to stand there like an ounce of ice would be a betrayal of 12-year-old promises I'd made to myself. I slipped off my boots and left my socks by the mat. The house was warm, and Sarah would wake if I moved too fast. My hands were steady, my heart was not. And then, before I could step to the threshold and let the conversation that would reshape everything begin, I paused. Outside, the wind tried to climb the porch. Inside, the house was full of sleeping people who trusted me to keep them safe. There was the neat geometry of a life I had made, and the wild, dark geometry of a life that had known me when I was a stranger to myself. I reached for the door because that was always what I had done, in storms and in small mercies. I pulled it back further, and the night breathed in and waited for my answer. I pulled the door wider, and the cold came in like a living thing, thin, sharp, a knife of night air that smelled of wet cedar and river mud. The thing on my porch bowed its head, like a man apologizing for taking up space in someone else's home. Up close, you could see the line of scar tissue along a shoulder, the scars of a life that had met more than one hard season. Its breath steamed in the porch light, and there was something in its eyes that did not belong to any animal I'd ever known. A slow, careful intelligence wrapped in a stillness that felt older than the county. It spoke then, the words spilling out in the halting cadence I'd heard once before, only deeper now. The consonants worn smooth by a long time of listening rather than speaking.
"Patrick," it said. "Friend, a pause, a small rattling in the throat. Need shelter. Old one sick. 3 need stay. Winter hard." My jaw hung like a door on a hinge. For a beat, one ridiculous, heavy beat, I thought I might sleepwalk into denial. The world that had been steady for 20 years was suddenly a different map. A stranger would have called it impossible. A man who'd kept a secret for 2 decades would call it a test. "Who are they?" I said instead, because that was the thing you ask when you're trying to keep your voice ordinary. Little Bit, taller now, shoulders like a small boulder, spoke words as if arranging stones into a cairn. Elder Ash, Morning, Reed, Baby, Old One cannot travel, need shelter near, near tower, safe place, friends. There was so much freight in that tiny phrase. Old One cannot travel, near tower, safe place, friends. It struck me how little it took to explain a huge thing. No maps, no numbers, no petitions to the press, just names and the kind of need that had once tugged me out into a blizzard. I remember hearing myself make the worst, the most practical sound a man can make in such a moment. You can't stay on the porch. You can't be in front of the house. My voice sounded small in the doorway, Little Bit stepped back as if the distance measured respect. He touched the frame with one big hand, and his forehead came to rest against the wood for a second. An odd private ritual. Not inside house. Shed, he said. We stay shed. No harm. I watch. I promise. The shed. I'd built it with my own hands a long time ago. Lumber stacked like a little cathedral of work behind the garage, insulated poorly but dry, used for a winter's worth of preserves and a storeroom for my odd jobs. It sat between the pines and the creek, off the path, where a person might plausibly say they were out checking the woodpile if someone asked. It was enough, maybe, if enough could be bent into a moral choice I could carry. I could feel the shape of the decision in my ribs. If news ever got out, if someone saw a hulking figure by my place, the life I'd built with Sarah and the children would be at risk. The sheriff might come with questions I didn't have the right answers for. Neighbors would talk. I thought of the men who hunt strange things for sport and for trophies and for money, and my chest tightened with a slow, cold fear. But then I thought of a small, shivering body I'd once bundled up in a truck and given shelter to without asking why. You don't unmake a promise by the width of a calendar. You honor it or you fail it. You sure? I asked, because what else do you say when you decide to break the quiet agreements of a life? Little Bit's shoulders rose in what might pass for a laugh. Patrick, he said slowly, and each syllable was a stone placed on a long pile. You helped once. You made shelter. We remember. Now old sick. No place. Please. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have. The porch light warmed my skin and the house softened behind me with the sleeping shapes of my family. I had to move carefully. If Sarah woke and came to the door and found a thing on my porch, I would lose more than the threat of a single night. I would lose the fragile trust that held our marriage steady. I could not ask her for a blind leap. I told Little Bit to wait and locked the door behind me. For the first time in years, my hands trembled while I moved. Tied boots on with fingers that wanted to do nothing but count the seams of the laces. I padded across the kitchen and peered into the dim of the bedroom. Sarah slept with her face turned to the window. There was a line at the corner of her mouth where life had written a map over the years, where laughter lived with frets. I swallowed hard and let the mattress dip with my weight when I sat at the edge beside her. "Sarah," I said, and the name in the dark felt like the smooth curve of an anchor. She woke with that particular groggy blink people have before they know the day's shape. I tried to keep my voice calm as I told her, halting and careful, that something was on the porch. "It's Little Bit," I said, and the name spilled out with a weird human tenderness that surprised me even as I spoke. Her eyes opened fully then. The sharpness in them was a familiar thing. Sarah in the light, Sarah at attention. She swung her legs to the floor the way a clock clicks into movement. "Little Bit?" she echoed, and there was all the disbelief in the world and an edge of steel. "What are you saying, Pat?" I told her quickly, in the bare, practical lines the moment needed. I included no grand metaphors, no flowery pleading. "He says 3 need shelter for the winter. An elder is sick. He says they'll stay in the shed. He promises no one comes inside the house. He asked me because of what I did once." She was silent for what felt like years. Then she swung her legs around and sat up straight. "Get them in the shed," she said. I stared at her. The muscles in her jaw moved like someone who had pressed a thought until it fit the space. "Pat, are you serious?" "I'm serious," I said, and I meant it. But I said it slowly because I wanted her to know she had been given the truth in every raw edge of it. She got dressed with a speed I hadn't seen since the time we hauled a calf out of a fence line. She wrapped herself in a sweater and the old coat she kept in the closet. She moved the way someone who has picked up other people's broken things for years does, with hands that understand how to hold an awkward weight without dropping it. At the shed, Little Bit stood like an apologetic sentinel, He knelt like a gent who'd learned to adapt his posture to human rules and helped me open the old door by leaning his shoulder into it. The shed smelled of dry earth and rope and the faint sweetness of last year's hay. I'd thought the palette of my life was simple: sawdust, oil, coffee. But I hadn't counted the smell of a place about to hold something important. It altered the air. Little Bit and I worked by the yellow light of a lantern, Sarah hammering a few extra boards while I set up a cot and stacked blankets. We preserved some of the old milk crates for food and sealed jars tight. Little Bit watched everything with the patience of a man who had mastered waiting. When I handed him a blanket, his fingers closed around the wool gently, as if handling a relic. He guided Morning in with a gait that suggested reverence and steadiness. Morning was younger than Little Bit, her hair a matte, dark curtain that she kept tucked behind her ear. Reed, small and dense as a knot, clung to her hip like a badge of warmth. Elder Ash's first look at me was something else entirely. He moved slowly, each step a study in gravity and grace, eyes like moons under heavy brows. He could not stand as he once might have. His back was bowed, not from age alone, but from whatever the long life of his people takes from a body. He smelled, like the forest floor in early spring after a thaw, like old birch bark and the copper tang of iron. When he looked up at me, it felt like the house of 1,000 years found my light and tested it for honesty. "You gave life once," Elder Ash said in that slow, formal English, translated by the cadence Little Bit had learned to carry. His voice was a thin thing, like a reed winded by a river. The translation in his words felt ceremonial. "You remember. We remember you. We come." I felt like a child again, called before the elders of a thing I did not fully understand. I wanted to retreat and to bury myself in a stack of logs and to let the world spin on without my interference. But Sarah stood close to my shoulder and her hand found mine, and in that touch there was a currency of consent, quiet, hard-won. She had crossed from mistrust into the realm of doing what needed to be done. It was a turning of a face toward another species that left me halfway astounded and fully grateful. We made rules that night that read like small prayers. No one would enter the house. The shed would not be advertised. Sarah would bring food as if delivering jars of preserves to a neighbor. Emma and Jake would not play near the shed. We spoke in low tones about boundaries and promised each other the currency of caution. Those first days were an education in a language made of living. Morning learned how to stack jars by sight, how to take a bowl and tilt it like anyone else, with the same awkwardness you see in kids learning forks. She handled a spoon with a cautious grace, and Reed, rebellious and nimble, stole a taste of jam one morning, and the world tilted toward laughter in the shed that smelled of sugar and hay. Little Bit perched by the door and made little noises that could be either worry or quiet pleasure. Sometimes he'd press his ear to the lantern and listen as if the flame were singing to him. Elder Ash taught us in a different way. He did not instruct in the mechanical sense, how to carve a handle or mend a wheel, but he told the kinds of stories that are made to put bones into a name. He had a voice that creaked like old floorboards, and it hummed with images that felt like wind through pines. There was one line he said to me in the first week that settled into my chest and did not leave. "We are dying slowly," he said. The words were not an accusation so much as a statement of weather. He told us, through the patient way of his speech, that their world had been trimmed and pruned over the years, roads eating at the edges, machines that did not look where they put their teeth, and an increasing number of nights where bright faces stared into the woods with cameras and did not look away. He spoke of songs they used to sing, of large clearings where once 1,000 stars had pushed through the gaps, and of the slow compression of places into smaller and smaller pockets. "Not only woods," Elder Ash said once, sitting back on a crate as if that were his throne, Memory of us is getting small. Children of the trees forget the old words. Rivers change. We move and there is less place to move. We are not angry, only tired. We ask kindness. There was a quiet in the shed after that. You could hear the small sounds of the place resettled, the tick of a jar cooling, the breath of a sleeping child outside, the wind hitting a corner of the roof. Sarah's eyes shone with a kind of pity that was not contempt. She wrapped a blanket more tightly around Elder Ash's shoulders as if to stitch the world back into warmth. The days slipped into a pattern that vibrated between wonder and nervousness. We learned small routines. I brought in ice-bound water in galvanized buckets and we thawed it on the stove. Sarah made stews and packed thermoses, and a little midnight tea that she'd set by the doorway as if it were an offering to a guest of honor. The kids knew something had shifted. They were not allowed near the shed, but children have ears that are better than our courage. Emma once stood at the kitchen window and watched morning lay a mat for Reed. She had a look on her face that was quiet and fierce, a private oath between her own small life and the unknown. There were moments that felt like stolen treasure. One night I put on the tape of Carole King I'd kept for a lifetime, the one Little Bit had once leaned his forehead against. I wound the tape, and there was that familiar piano. Little Bit sat cross-legged near the lantern and closed his massive hands around his knees. Elder Ash's face, usually a slate of careful lines, softened. He hummed a low note that sounded like it belonged to the trees, a thin echo behind the piano. On the far side of the shed, morning hummed, matching the tone. Reed slept against her chest, a warm pebble. Those hours were a lesson in the reciprocity of small things. When you offer room to another life, sometimes what you get back is a quiet you've never owned before. Little Bit would sometimes reach out and set his hand on my forearm like an old friend saying, "We are together." Once, when the wind was high, he put both palms on the wood door and looked at me. "You keep promises," he said. "You made house. You keep. We give story." The stories kept coming. Elder Ash told of a time when the ridgelines were full of roaming folk like himself, when names were a chain of landscape and nothing had to hide. He talked of Morning's mother as if reading from a map, places that no longer existed, the way a person loses their hometown, and those were the parts of his tale that made a man like me ache. The knowledge that a shape of life is vulnerable, not just to shots, but to forgetting. Weeks slid by in a hush. December thinned into January, and the winter grew teeth. Snow came heavy some nights, and so quiet you could hear the way it smothered the world. We kept to our rules. The shed became a small community that existed on gossip and bread, on the exchange of food and the making of beds. For 2 months it felt like a living secret, stitched carefully between the house and the pines. And then the thing that had been waiting for us like a shadow arrived in the person of Dale Morrison. Dale was a neighbor. He owned a strip of land a mile down the ridge and liked to tell stories at the diner that grew with every cup of coffee. He was the sort of man who notices details because he's used to filling the piecemeal silence with talk. One afternoon, working the property lines near my place, he saw tracks. They started at the creek and went around where the shed sat, enormous and deep, pressed into the thawing snow. He saw them and peered into the dark. He came close enough to see the dim outline of something large in the shed window. Dale's mouth went small, like someone whose first reaction is to apologize to the world. He turned and ran. Dale had always been a practical man, but when you catch a thing out of its place, you don't get to be wise about it. Panic is fast and unwise and honest. He drove into Hamilton and did what Dale does. He told people at the diner. He called Sheriff Anderson on the phone and told him about the tracks, about the hulking shapes near Carter's place. Word slid across the county faster than a weather front. I was cutting wood when I heard the distant roar of a truck and felt the way the air tightened. Little Bit and Morning were in the shed, Elder Ash sleeping on a pile of blankets and humming a song about birches.
Reed slept like a knot of warm cloth against Morning's shoulder. We had been careful, but nothing that waits on the other side of human curiosity forever remains invisible. I could hear the truck before I saw it. Tires chewing the loose gravel, voices warm with worry. Sarah could have told me to turn away, to let the world find out and burn the secret out with light. But she stood with me where the porch met the cold and watched as the sheriff's truck pulled in. The light from the dash slashed the yard into angles. "You stayed quiet too long," she said, not bitter, simply factual, as a woman might note that a cake had burned. There was no repentance in her voice, only a practical pivot toward what needed doing. Now we have to do the getting out part. We moved fast then, with a speed that felt like obedience. Littlebit and I stashed the essentials in a pack: blankets, a bottle of water, a bag of canned peaches Sarah had insisted on, a small carving knife I'd never worried about before, and a flask of coffee in case the road took too long. There were no miracles in our preparation, only urgency, which has its own kind of holiness. Elder Ash woke with a clarity that looked like farewelling. He sat up slowly, the movement of someone who had all the time in his bones and knew better than to squander it on fear. He put both hands on mine, big, slow hands that trembled slightly, and he said, with a voice that made me want to be brave for him, "We go now. Thank you." Morning pressed a wet face to my shoulder, as if to memorize it. Reed reached up with fingers that were both clumsy and exact, and wrapped them around the end of my thumb like he was learning what a human touch felt like. I knelt and felt the small weight of a life I had helped carry. We left the shed like a handful of vows. Littlebit moved as a man who could carry 1,000 pounds, and whose feet made no sound you could place on a map. Morning cradled Elder Ash for short distances. Sometimes Elder Ash rode with a rhythm that sent him forward like an old carriage. We headed toward the trees and the creek and the matted places where the snow kept softer the further from the house you went. By the time we'd moved perhaps a half-mile, the world began to sound like a place that had divided into two sides. One side where the sheriff and Dale stood with a flashlight and a dozen questions, and the other where a line of beings like shadows walked. Sheriff Anderson found tracks leading away from my yard and stopped at the shed, where he saw nothing but an open door and an old coat left on the step. He looked at me with the slow patience of a man who will try reason before force. "Patrick," he said, "someone reported something. Care to explain?" "There are arguments you can have in daylight and ones you cannot." I told him that I'd had some animals in the shed, that they left when the snow got thin, that nothing was there now. I said it slowly and plainly, because if you lie too fancifully, the line in your face shows, and people read it. He looked without a skepticism that was cruel, more the skeptical thing of a man who's been awake to every kind of possibility human beings get into. He measured me like a scale. There was no point in telling him the truth. Telling the truth would have been a dangerous thing that would have put the fragile life we were moving into the world like meat in the open. So I told the half-truth that served to keep my family whole. Sheriff Anderson left with a cautionary look that felt like a benediction in the wrong language. He drove away, and Dale stood on his porch and cursed the whole thing in a way that made my teeth ache. We had a clear path when the moment came to pull away. A narrow, frozen drainage that led into an old logging road, a thread of path that faded into the trees. Littlebit and Morning and Reed moved like they knew the outline. Elder Ash slid between the pines with the patience of a man who has been shown the way to cross a country you were born into. Reed sang once, a small sound that made me think of the first chickadee in spring. And then the forest took us. The night had teeth. I remember the way the snow loaded our knees and the woods pressed close, a green wall that smelled of sap and the slow, old rot of things that have lasted. At one point a low wind came and the branches clacked like old bones. My lungs burned. My legs wanted to stop. I thought of Emma and Jake sleeping back at the house, and of the cup of coffee that would not be had. I thought of my promises to myself and how promises are not ledgered things, but the small daily acts that shape who you are. We stopped twice to rest. Once, in a small hollow, Elder Ash's breath came shallow and his hands shook like leaves. He looked at me and said, "You made the small mercy. It is big." He closed his eyes and then opened them again as if taking in everything there was to see. His face had an expression of a man who is both weary and content. I remember the way that single phrase, "You made the small mercy," felt like a rope I could hang on to in a storm. The distance we covered was not long by a map, but in a life weight it was enormous. We had to cross a creek where the ice was thin and the water ran outrageously loud. Little Bit took Reed by the scruff and swung him over on his shoulder like he was hauling a sack. Morning's boots slipped once, and I grabbed her wrist with a reflex I did not know I had, and she looked at me like someone who had been given solid ground by accident. In that reach there was no shame, only the common human thing of hands meeting to keep a life from slipping. When we reached a place where the mountains broke into a small gulch, a place with a stand of older pines and a rocky hollow that might be claimed by no one for long enough to give cover, we laid Elder Ash down and made a small bed of branches and blankets. He was quieter than I'd ever seen him. He sang a line of something that felt like a lullaby, and then he stopped.
We walked at night and rested by day, living like people who hover between the world's edges. There were times I thought we could not go on. There were mornings when the children wanted their father, and when I hesitated at a fork and imagined turning back to the house. But every time I looked at Morning holding Reed or Little Bit keeping the watch, I felt the currency of what I'd done. Mercy is not a small coin that buys sleep. It is a ledger that asks constant contributions. We reached a place that morning where the trees were fewer and the ridgeline opened into an old bowl of meadows. I stood on a small rise and looked back at the world I had almost always known. A thin ribbon of a road, a flash of roofs in the valley, the little dot that was the tower blinking like an eye. I thought of Sarah and the kids and the small, steady life that I would be choosing to either keep or lose. The choice hummed and felt heavier than snowfall. It was here that Little Bit stopped and turned toward me. He had changed in ways that were more than physical. His face, if you can call it that, had the look of someone who had learned to be human enough to stay hidden for someone else's sake. He put his hand on my shoulder, as if to make sure that the unmeasured debt between us was understood. "Patrick," he said, halting, each word deliberate and clean like ice on a tongue. "We go now. We are quiet. You keep house." I nodded. I could not ask for more. He did not stay to watch me, but instead took up a slow step that made him almost vanish in the whitened grass. Morning and Reed followed like a small tide. We watched them go until the trees swallowed their shapes. I stood there a long while, the world breathing cold air over my face. I went back to the house with my pockets full of snow and my hands empty. The months that followed were ordinary in the way that grief makes everything else shrink. Sarah's face took on a particular piece of hardness that comes from having been part of a decision larger than you are. The kids asked no questions at first. They noticed only that their father came home with a softness about him, like a man who'd been stretched and then returned. I continued to do tower work and odd jobs, and I kept the old photograph in my toolbox like a conviction. A few weeks later, on a morning that was full of pale sun, I found a small carved thing on the windowsill of my kitchen. It was the figure Elder Ash had given me, but changed, worked over with a care that made it finer, every line worn a little smoother by someone else's hand. Beside it lay a piece of birch bark with a pictograph scratched into its surface, a crude image of a tree and 3 shapes under it, and a small line that looked like someone had tried to make the shape of a face. It wasn't words. It didn't need to be. I set the carving on the table and ran my thumb along the grain and felt the echo of that winter like heat.
The birch picture was folded like a small letter, and in the fold there was a small note in a woman's hand. Morning's hand had learned my alphabet enough to write, and it read simply, "We go. Thank you. We remember." I have kept those things in a box beneath the Bible on the shelf. Sometimes I take them out and look at them like a man examines a scar. They are not proof, not in the sense of a newspaper clipping or a photograph. Tools of proof have this way of reducing the magic of what they document to a flat thing to be argued over. The carved figure and the birch bark are more like a conversation between real lives, a small testament that some kindness was returned. My life settled back into a rhythm, but a change had set in as quietly as a tide. I listened differently after that. When the radio hummed on nights I worked at Tower 7, when the wind pressed itself against the porch, I felt the memory of a pair of hands big enough to carry a man's weight. Sometimes the smell of cedar would find me, and my chest would compress with a double-sided ache, joy at what had been done, and sorrow for all that had to remain hidden. People still talk at the diner now and then about strange things by the river. Dale still tells the story of the tracks he saw, and the way the sheriff's truck moved like a thing out to right the balance. Sheriff Anderson and I exchange a nod in summer when he stops by to check the town repeater. He never asked me for details. We both have the grace to let certain edges remain unpushed. I have aged in ways that feel honest. The truck, my old '71 Chevy, carries more rust than shine. Emma is grown now, with a life that extends beyond the county line. Jake drives the road sometimes with Sarah's laugh in his face. We have a family that is complex and light and full of that small human business. The secret sits between us like a small, honored thing. Occasionally Sarah renders it in quiet ways. A jar set at the shed door on a day when the wind was cruel. A blanket left folded just so by the porch. Sometimes she looks at me in the middle of supper and nods as if to say, "You were a better man for doing that, and I have learned to be one too." Twice since that winter, I felt the hush of 3 knocks at the door. Once was a year later when Littlebit came alone and left a strip of carved bark with the sound of a song etched into it. Once was on a calm autumn night when I thought I saw a silhouette at the tree line, tall, patient, but it dissolved before I reached the porch. These are the kind of things that a person learns to carry, flashes that confirm nothing and mean everything. The last time was a slow afternoon in early summer, when I found the carved wooden figure on the windowsill and the birch pictograph tucked beneath it. The little carving was fine now, more intricate than the one Elder Ash had left. It had been worked into the shape of a small man with outstretched arms, and there was the faint smell of sap on the grain. The birch bark pictograph showed a tree and 3 shapes, and beneath someone had scratched in a line that looked like a road and a small arrow pointing north. I set them on the shelf and sat in my chair and felt the years fold around me like a map that I'm still learning to read. Sarah filled my cup and placed it down with a little clink that felt like a benediction. "You did what you could," she said. I did what I could. I told myself that more times than I can count, sometimes as a prayer, sometimes as a justification for a life tilted toward mercy. There were nights when I'd stand looking out at the ridgeline and hear the echo of a small voice. "Patrick, friend, never forgot." It is a line that has the weight of river stones. It sits in my chest like an anchor that makes it harder to drift into bitterness. People ask me now what I think about the whole thing. Some want proof, some want a tale that will fit their sense of the world. I tell them what I know, no more, no less. I tell them about a night in a blizzard and a small animal's hand, about a shed and a child called Reed and an elder who taught us that the world shrinks not by one dramatic event, but by the steady forgetting of what we once held sacred. I tell them about the thing that came to my door 20 years later with 3 knocks, and how the choice I made then shaped the rest of my life.
There are questions I carry that never leave. Did I do right by my children? Did I choose secrecy when honesty would have been braver? Would the sheriff have understood if I told him the truth then and there? I have no tidy answers. I only have the thing in my hands, that carved figure, the weight of a promise, and a memory of a life saved and set loose. If you ask me what the moral is, I say this: small mercies ripple. They are not great, thunderous things. They are bowls of soup on a high shelf, a folded blanket, the willingness to keep a secret you were asked to keep because someone else could not risk the telling. Those small acts accumulate and change you in ways you feel in the shape of your heart. Once, when the wind was a steady poor thing, I found myself thinking of the world as a big, slow animal that we were all rising and falling on. The choices we make, what to hide, what to reveal, what to protect, we make them with our hands and then wait to see how the world will line up. The carving on my shelf and the birch bark on my window are small answers to a single question I had in that blizzard. Is kindness enough? It was enough that night. It was not a guarantee of safety forever for anyone. It was a choice made under a porch light by a man who chose to honor a fragile life for reasons that were both selfish and generous. I have no claims beyond the story. That is what I know. Years later, when I sit with the radio humming and the kids off in lives that are their own, I keep the carving on the windowsill where the light hits it.
Sometimes I run my thumb along its carved arm and feel the worn grain. In the quiet, you can still hear the echo of a knock, 3 deliberate taps that sounded like a promise kept and a debt paid without ledger or headline. If this story has a last line, it is a small one. Kindness crosses the spaces between us in ways you cannot account for, and once given, it returns in forms you will not always expect. What I did that night in the blizzard was not a grand thing. It was a mercy. 20 years later, that mercy returned to my door and asked, quietly, with a hand on the wood, for shelter. I opened the door. What would you have done?